final exam project. I can send out, and I will send out, I keep thinking I might want to write one or two more questions, just to broaden the field of available things. But I have a final exam already in mind, and those of you who want to write a written final exam, it's coming right up, right? You can do so. And also, I need to send out our essay topics, and I will do that this weekend, maybe later today or tomorrow. I'll send out our essay topics. And then our final exam questions, for those of you who want to write a written final exam, will be, of course, different than our essay topics. But I could easily include a question about lower snake dam removal, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. And what I have in mind for for those of you who don't want to write, or who might want to, you might want to write but would rather do a group presentation. And that group presentation would take place during the final exam, the official final exam session. It's about a 2-hour period of time on Thursday of final exam week that we have, that we would use for that. Okay, and what it would be a mock hearing, or a model hearing on lower snake dam removal. Okay, and since this is a federal issue, I mean, the federal government would have jurisdiction over, to make a law, because basically because the lower snake and the Columbia are navigable streams. The federal government has jurisdiction. They decide ultimately what's going to happen. So our mock hearing would be in front of some agency of the federal government. I haven't figured all this out yet, but we would divide up into 2 groups, and the 2 groups would be responsible for meeting separately outside of class to prepare. Right? So I'll get this all hammered out over the weekend, probably tomorrow or Saturday, and I'll send it out in an email to everybody. Okay? And the idea is that you can either write, you can write a final exam, written final exam, and the questions would be very similar to the questions that were on the midterm. All right? Only they would focus on one of the foci. Would be, at least one question would deal with lower snake dam removal, okay? So you could do that in written form, or you could participate in a group project. And some people want to participate in a group project, so I imagine there'll be about a quarter to a third of you who will choose the written option. And since there are about 45, 46 people currently enrolled in the class, that'll leave, I don't know, probably about 30 people, I would imagine. About 30 people who will end up, instead of be 15 people on one side and 15 people on the other side. And it would be a mock hearing in front of probably the Department of the Interior. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, under the Department of the Interior or something like that. Actually, the NOAA is in charge of National Oceanic, used to be called National Marine Fisheries Service, but they're in charge of salmon recovery. The salmon are anadromous. They spend most of their lives actually in the ocean. So National Marine Fisheries Service, now called NOAA, which is interesting. NOAA's in charge of recovering salmon populations in the Northwest. You know what I said about Noah's Ark, the original Endangered Species Act. The most economically, most expensive salmon recovery program in the history of the Endangered Species Act is the Endangered Columbia snake salmon runs. They spend a great deal of money trying to keep those guys alive, trying to keep that, that genetic strain, those wild salmon that spawn in Idaho, trying to keep them going. They spend a great deal of money, and then they also spend money on foregoing power generation. As you can imagine, if you want to try to save those endangered salmon, you have to speed up the river, right? And to speed up the river, it means you have to forego power generation, because it means you have to you have to let the river flow over the dam to speed it up, right? And so there's all kinds of cost in foregone power generation as well, to keep those endangered salmon alive. But anyway, that's what I have in mind for the. And tied into this question, as every question is when it comes to dams on the Columbia and Snake River, is the larger question of anthropogenic, not question, but issue of anthropogenic climate destabilization, anthropogenic climate disintegration, right? Which needs to be considered and often is cited as a reason not to do anything to the dam and the hydropower generation system on the Columbia and Snake Rivers, right? Because that is so-called clean energy, right? And we want more clean energy, we want less dirty energy, which contributes, right? That's the argument. I don't want to prejudice people one way or the other, but that's the argument that some people make, right? That we want more so-called clean energy from hydropower, and that means we don't want to be talking about removing the 4 lower snake dams, right? Because that would be crazy. In an era where the number one environmental concern is anthropogenic climate destabilization, why would we remove the source of major clean energy, right? Anyway, so every question about power generation or power, or for example, the fracked oil that they already are, and they're talking about dramatically increasing the transportation of from North Dakota, down these rails, down the Columbia Gorge, onto these oil tankers, right? Keep your eye on that Port of Vancouver. Tesoro Savage Oil Terminal at the Port of Vancouver. Right, but in an era of anthropogenic climate destabilization, every energy issue that comes before us in the Northwest is not only a local issue, right, involving potential pollution, catastrophic pollution to our waterways and our salmon runs and our natural resources, etc., but also involves, right, contributing to a system of relying on fossil fuels, which contributes to the larger story, right, the much larger story, the global story of anthropogenic climate destabilization. So anyway, all these things are interrelated, right? These issues are all interrelated. And I would expect those of you, those 30 approximately of you who will choose to do the group presentations, that you'll have to deal with both the local issues involving our salmon runs and right, we're talking about removing 4 lower snake dams, right? So you're going to talk about the local issues, and you're also going to talk about the larger global issues involving energy and anthropogenic climate destabilization. Okay, yes?
If we chose the group project, are we assigned group members, or do we have to pick our own?
Well, I'll work that out over the weekend, I promise, okay? So we'll have more to talk about on Tuesday when I have the details all worked out. But that probably, in a class like this, more people tend, you guys kind of know where I'm coming from, right? I have these bizarre little conservative tendencies and these bizarre little ways, but for the most part, I line up with the radical environmentalists, I take fun and, I take joy sort of in pointing out how some of these radical environmentalists meta-ethically line themselves up with these cultural conservatives, and then we got to sort all that out and figure out what's going on there, But I kind of relish pointing that out. In some ways, I'm a cultural conservative, because I'm saying that life is sacred, we got to worry about all this stuff, right? And in this weird way, if some self-described cultural conservatives were more self-aware of their own arguments, they would be radical environmentalists too, right? Because they'd be saying, geez, man, look at what we're doing. We're tearing the whole fabric of God's creation, And interestingly enough, the Pope probably is the best example of this very, very, traditionally very conservative point of view, and this conservative institution, right, with this huge momentum, conservative inertia behind it, right? What could be more conservative as a global institution than the Vatican, right? And yet the Vatican now is coming out on the side of the radical environmentalists, right? Through this Pope Francis guy, Anyway, it's kind of interesting. But as I'm fond of pointing out, the meta-ethics of the radical environmentalists have something in common, dramatically, right? They're both inclined towards saying that our moral obligations to the natural world are evident objectively, right? We can, like Rolston says, we can identify our moral I would like to know more about Rolston's view on some of these other philosophical questions, regarding the issues that are near and dear to cultural conservatives, like abortion and marriage equality and stuff like that. But in any event, that's not our concern today. So I.F. Stone gave this, somebody referenced the Earth Day, and the very first Earth Day was in April of 1970. And this is going to sound a lot like what we're going to pick up on next week, not next week. Next week is our week for deep ecology, and the week after that is our week for social ecology. And this is going to sound like a very much of a social ecological analysis of of the kinds of natural resource issues and concerns that people were raising at the first Earth Day. Okay? So this is what our friend I.F. Stone, who wrote this great book on the trial of Socrates, is still a little bit enigmatic. You know, what happened to our great ancestor Socrates? You know, the first, the Socratic method, you know, that's kind of what we do as philosophers. And he was killed by the state, right? The state gave him an option of either exiling himself, going away, never coming back, right? So get the hell out of town, you know, or drinking this hemlock, right, and dying. And he chose to drink the hemlock, and he died. And he was 70 years old. And there's still a little bit of a, to make a long story short, it seems as though what happened was that Socrates was this guy who said that we can use the powers of human reason to gain access to a realm of moral truth, ultimately, a moral truth and truth about the physical world, too. And that thesis in and of itself, right? The thesis that we can use the powers of ration, and we don't need any kind of authority to tell us what is of ultimate import, right, in life. And that thesis in itself is radical, right? And so they charged him with corrupting the youth, and that, you know, and they killed him. But anyway, he wrote this book. I.F. Stone wrote this book called The Trial of Socrates, and he actually, late in life, in his 70s, very late in life, I.F. Stone learned to read and speak Greek in order to understand what was going on, ancient Greek. I know he couldn't speak it, but he learned to read ancient Greek in order to help him understand, you know, exactly what happened to our unfortunate ancestor, Socrates. In any event, this is what he had to say on the first Earth Day. In the ancient world, the Caesars did it with bread and circuses, and tonight, I'm afraid, is the first time that our Caesars have learned to do it with rock and roll and idealism and non-inflammatory social issues. In some ways, I'm sorry to say, we here tonight are being conned. This has many of the aspects of a beautiful snow job. The country is slipping into a wider war in Southeast Asia, right, the Vietnam War, and we're talking about litter bugs. The Secretary of Defense on Monday made a speech to the Associated Press sabotaging the SALT. These are strategic arms limitation talks on nuclear weapons, right, with the Soviet Union to reduce nuclear weapons in the world. The Secretary of Defense made a speech to the Associated Press sabotaging the SALT talks, presenting a completely false picture of the world balance of power, ending what little hope we had of progress in those talks, preparing the way for a bigger, more expensive arms race at the expense of mankind. And we're talking as if we needed more wastebaskets. The divisions of white and black in this country are getting to the point where they threaten our future, and we're talking about pollution. And it's not that pollution is not an important subject, but if the Nixon administration feels so deeply about it, why don't they do something substantial about it? One important thing about this town is that you can never take very seriously what the officials say. They're the prisoners of a vast bureaucracy. Much of what they say is merely rationalization of their lack of momentum. I'm not sure if we should read this whole thing, but I'm not sure how long it is. It's pretty long, huh? Anyway, I was reminded of this, you know, because sometimes it does seem a bit odd that here we are talking about environmental ethics in a society which is so flagrantly at odds with the whole idea that we should be taking seriously, right, our obligations to ecological wholes. And yet, you know, I mean, our guys, our scientists, right, scientists are you know, they're kind of the ones that since Enlightenment, you know, since this 18th, 17th, and 18th century, we have looked up to scientists as providing truth, right? And they're telling us that, you know, that we need to stop doing most of what we're doing in terms of consuming fossil fuels, and our technological capacities have far outstripped Earth's capacities, you know, to renew herself. Anyway, so let's just kind of sum up. This was during the Vietnam War. Of course, we've got war going on all over the place, and we've got war, probably more warfare going on in the world than there was in the 1960s and 70s. And I don't see any sign of anybody in Washington, D.C. really talking about ending all this warfare. But the number one consumer of fossil fuels, of course, is the U.S. military. And anyway, we need to make fundamental changes, is what I.F. Stone teaches us. And he gets into the Army and the military, you know, which of course brings my mind back to the Snake River dams. Remember those all 8 of the dams, that juvenile salmon originating in the breadbasket of the Columbia Basin, right? This is where 40% of the most valuable, the upriver bright Chinook, right, originate. They have to cross 8 dams. And guess who built and controls and operates all 8 of those dams? Golly, the Army Corps of Engineers? You're kidding me. Anyway, that's just interesting. So those are military installations, in other words, right? I mean, can we be frank about that? And that's odd to think of our country as being militarized at this fundamental level, you know, and yet the Army has this very, very strong presence in our landscape, you know, that far exceeds the presence that it has anywhere else, really, because we have these salmon and and the Army has all these dams, right, that totally, completely change our ecosystem. And, you know, and yet, I don't know, very few people talk about that fact, that mere fact, that those are military installations. Anyway, and we have warfare going on, you know, and we have the U.S. military being the world's #1 consumer of fossil fuels by far, right? And then we have back then, you know, 1970, April 22nd, 1970, the Vietnam War is raging. And we had General Wheeler, the retiring chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying in an interview that criticism of the military was due to a communist plot, right? This is an effort of the military to revive McCarthyism, to preserve, right? Anyway. All right, so you know there is no use talking about Earth Day unless we are prepared to make fundamental changes. Everybody's talking about Earth Day and it comes out of the mouths of so many hypocrites it turns your stomach. What kind of Earth Day can we celebrate in a country that is spending so much of its money to destroy the Earth? How can we talk of reverence for life when we're spending so much on our enemy, our genius, our money, and our youth on building up new means of destroying life? It's kind of crazy, isn't it? In wilderness preservation, it's kind of crazy, right? When we set aside 3% of North America is set aside for wilderness, and all different definitions, not just wilderness, but, you know, anyway, and all the rest is what? A sacrifice zone? You know, and then here we are celebrating Earth Day. What kind of an Earth Day can we celebrate in a country that's spending so much of its money to destroy the Earth? Anyway, what's the use of talking about the pollution of air and water when we live under a precarious balance of terror, which can, here they're talking about potential nuclear war, right? Make the entire northern hemisphere of our planet. It's interesting how people don't really talk that much about it, even though the danger is just as high, if not higher. Right? I guess other issues and other concerns have eclipsed. But all through the 50s and 60s and 70s, people were very, very concerned about the potential of nuclear catastrophe through an accident or through a deliberate act of some rogue state, right? Nobody talks about that anymore. It's really interesting. Anyway. There's no use talking about Earth Day until we begin to think like Earthmen. Not as Americans and Russians, not as blacks and whites, not as Jews and Arabs, but as fellow travelers on a tiny planet in an infinite universe. All that we can muster of kindness, of compassion, of patience, of thoughtfulness is necessary if this tiny planet of ours is not to go down to destruction. Until we have a leadership willing to make the enormous changes, psychological, military, and bureaucratic, to end the existing world system, a system of hatred, of anarchy, of murder, of war and pollution, there is no use talking about buying more wastebaskets or spending a couple of $100 million on the Missouri River. If we do not challenge these fundamental causes of peril, we will be conned by the establishment while basic decisions are being made over which we have very little control, though they endanger everything on which our future and the world's future depend. So, There's IF stone ringing through the ages, hopefully. But the problems are still, obviously, they're even worse. And in the irony of talking about environmental ethics, you know, it's amazing. It's just amazing. I was thinking about wellness. I went over to that wellness fair. Did anyone go over to that at the rec center? Yeah, the wellness fair. I shouldn't say anything negative, you know. But
No, I feel it was
I just noted the irony as I was walking around there. I noted the irony of a wellness fair in a university which is inaccessible, in which so many of its students are just stressed out economically because they can't afford the tuition, right? Because these decisions have been made at a wider level, right, at a social level, which are anti-wellness. They're anti-wellness. They're sickening. They're disease-causing decisions that are being made by these people at higher levels. And yet here we are having a wellness fair, right? When our waterways are being polluted, our air is being trashed, right? And our access to education and healthcare is being systematically reduced, right? Increasingly restricted, right? Healthcare, I mean, come on, why don't we have universal healthcare? We have wellness fairs. Where was the booth? Was there a booth? I hope there was. I didn't notice. Was there a booth advocating universal healthcare at the wellness fair?
no, there was Monster Energy.
Was there a booth? Exactly, it's commercialization. If you go around and get your damn ticket stamped and you enter the raffle, right? 5 different vendors, right? You got to go to 5 different vendors, right? You got to go to vendors in order to get your wellness. Because wellness is something you buy and sell now in the marketplace. Like education, which is a fundamental wrong, morally grave wrong in itself, to privatize education, to sell, to marketize, to commercialize education. All these issues are tied together, right? And, perhaps Thomas Birch, reminds us that even a great deal of 20th century North American environmentalism has gone hand in hand with the quest to dominate Earth, right? Which, anyway, and we can get into that a little bit, I suppose, today. But I did start to draw our natural resource values wheel on the board, and I'm not, we might end up going home early today. I'm not sure. I think that all the lecture notes that I have, we've mostly gone through. Some of them we haven't gone through very carefully, or even at all, really. But I thought that today we might do a closer reading of Thomas Birch's essay and talk a little bit about, and then also maybe start talking a little more about the Lower Snake dams, since although I think perhaps we do have one class period where I have identified that as our moral struggle for the day. But since we're going to do that for our final exam, I thought it might be wise to try to connect some of what Thomas Birch has to say to our principal moral struggle, which I think it's fair to say those Lower Snake dams are perhaps the principal struggle. If there is anything left of a sort of a Pacific Northwest environmentalist movement, then that is probably near the top of that movement's agenda. If it was, if that movement was to itemize, what it's trying to accomplish, the removal of those 4, and it doesn't even seem like that much to ask for, really. The removal of those 4 Lower Snake dams doesn't even seem, it's actually quite a modest goal, really, sadly enough. And it's a commentary on our political system that those dams were even built and that they're still there. But these are the ones we're talking about right here. And these are those 8 that I was referring to earlier, right? This is the breadbasket. Right here in the Lower Snake, this right here, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Chinook would spawn right in through here. And now it's all, of course, buried under 60. They can't spawn there anymore. There's no way, because the water slowed down and the eggs would never get enough oxygen. So all that habitat has been wiped out. This is the last free-flowing section of the Columbia. It's called the Hanford Reach, right? And there was a dam picked out that they were going to build right about here called Benjamin Franklin Dam. And But because of World War II and the need to operate the nuclear refinery there, the power, this is where they refined the uranium into plutonium that was put into the bombs that were dropped over Nagasaki and Hiroshima in World War II. And because they needed all that water from the river, that's why they built those reactors right there, the Hanford reactors. Yeah. They needed all that water. So anyway, they canceled originally they wanted to build a dam right there. But anyway, so as a result, it's by accident, right? Kind of a, you know, the fact that that nuclear facility is there is what ended up saving this. But the reason I'm saying all this Hanford Reach, every year, 400,000 adult Chinook spawners are counted. Biologists go and they keep track of all this, right? And they row up and down in their boats, you know, and they count all the spawning. And anyway, this is an incredibly fertile area, right? So imagine how fertile this was, right? And then of course all these tributaries. This is the Salmon River here, and this is the Clearwater. Sometimes I get these mixed up. Anyway, it's the Salmon and the Clearwater. This is the this one flows into northeastern Oregon. What is that? The Imnaha or the Grand Ronde River. Anyway, but these are very, you know, this is all, by the way, this is the heart of Nez Perce territory, right? The Nez Perce Indians. These are the guys that saved Lewis and Clark in their expedition. And Lewis and Clark were all bedraggled and starved to death and frozen to death, right? Because they made that miscalculation because they were relying on the mythology of their time, that there was this Northwest Passage, and they could just go rowing their boats right up the Missouri, right? Up the Mississippi and then up the Missouri, and the headwaters of the Missouri would be right here, and then boom, they just walk over, right? That's what they thought. But they were in error. And in the Bitterroot Mountains, they almost died if they hadn't been saved by the Nez Perce Indians, right? And they sheltered them over the winter, and they gave them food and, you know, got them back to health. And then they went on their way. But anyway, this was incredibly abundant, right? It's very hard to describe how abundant, you know, the source of everything. Anyway, so that's what we're talking about when we talk about these 4 lower snake dams, right? They slow down the river, they add twice as much. Even if we don't talk about removing these, right? Just removing these is going to remove 50% of the obstacles they have to go through. They all have fish passage facilities, right? That's not the issue. All of these, I think this one does not. This is a hideous monstrosity, this Dvorak. What they've done up here is just an absolute disgrace. But anyway, I think now they truck the salmon. I think there's still some spawning habitat up in here in the tributaries. Anyway, I think there's no fish ladder here, but I think they trap them still. They do that every year. They trap them and then they drive them up and let them go. But anyway, there are fish ladders at all of these dams, right? But is there a fish ladder for a juvenile salmon? No. There's no down ladder. There's no way to get down the river. There's no way to get over these dams for a juvenile. And when these dams were all constructed, nobody thought of that. Or they thought of it, but they ignored it, right? Because they wanted to keep telling the public that we could have fish and power too, right? And it was a lie. And a lot of them knew it was a lie. Some of them didn't know, and they really believed it. But anyway, so the problem is the juveniles can't get past these dams safely. They have to go over the spillway, and that causes all kinds of trouble for them. They get sick, and then they fall prey to predators, to both birds and sea lions and stuff. And not sea lions. Sea lions aren't going to give a crap about a juvenile salmon, but birds mainly. Different kinds of birds will eat the...
There was some case of sea lions going up the Columbia.
Well, they eat the adults. Yeah, they eat the adults. That's what I'm saying. They're not interested. You know, the smolts, a Chinook smolt will be maybe 10 to 12 inches, right? And they're on a schedule, right? They evolve. It's real simple if you just get rid of all the residue of industrial civilization that's lingering and rattling around in your brains, and just realize that everything on Earth evolved, you know, under certain conditions, right? And these salmon evolved under a flow regime of the river, right? And that flow regime has been dramatically altered. And so these salmon that used to make it down, just riding the current, within about 10 days, right? The salmon that was born up here, would make it down when it was time, right? They don't go down right away. They hang out here for a while. They live in the fresh water for about a year, and depending on the subspecies, right? All different conditions anyway. And they don't even really swim. They just ride the current. Now, how long does it take? 3-4 weeks, right? Because the river has been slowed down so dramatically. And then every time they come to one of these dams, they have to go tumbling over this spillway, which makes them sick. And then about half of, 10% of them or so die. I've read that 10 to 15% mortality rate at every dam. And so what does the Army Corps of Engineers do? In their infinite wisdom and their wonderful utilitarian calculations, they collect about half of them. They could collect them all. They trap them all, and then about half of them, they just let them go on their way, right? And the other half, after they trap them, they have these very expensive smolt collecting devices. They put them on barges, or they put them on trucks, and they drive them all the way down here, and then they let them go down here. And that's what we do. That's what we've been doing since the mid-1970s. This last Lower Snake Dam was finished in 1975. This one, I think, was finished in 1964. So within about 10 or 12 years, we built all 4 of those dams. And really, ever since the federal government built them, people have been talking about removing them because they have such a dramatic impact. We already lost the June hogs, right? This is the end of the line for salmon. They don't, all this, thousands of miles of spawning habitat, and then up here too, thousands of miles. And this map doesn't show. There are rivers that come down this way, the Mulier, anyway. I think they even had salmon spawning in Nevada, Columbia Basin salmon spawning in Nevada, and even in Utah, believe it or not. But all that habitat has been cut off now, right? And you can go online and see different maps, and it's like darkening, right? The maps darken the landscape, right? They darken. Before it was bright because the salmon could go, and now you can see historically there are different time-lapse maps you can go to online to learn about how we've eclipsed so much, over half of available salmon habitat has been blocked off. Anyway, but I always, I try to keep the larger picture in mind. Of course, up here we have our relatives living in Puget Sound, right? And they 78% of their diet, and they come out here and they travel all up and down here, right? But that's one of their hallmarks of their cultures. They dine, they go to fancy restaurants and they dine on excellent food, right? They only like their Chinook salmon, and most of that Chinook salmon comes from in here, right? And then we have our humans too. Our traditional human animals, have all their fishing sites. Most of their fishing sites are all in through here. So there's a salmon cycle, right? Historically, geologically, this part of the world has produced this amazing cycle of salmon that has sustained both humans and then infinite numbers of wildlife and different species all through the Northwest. And remember,